Welcome to the Pistis with Us podcast, where our faith unites us in conversation. You can expect thought-provoking discussions with theologians, pastors, scholars, and all other Christians who share the testimony of God's amazing grace. We invite you to be a part of our community to share your thoughts, questions, and stories. Join the conversation. Thank you for joining another episode of the Pistis with Us podcast. I am your host, Raleigh Clay, and I am joined today by someone who I've really been looking forward to speaking with, Dr. Nijay Gupta, who is a professor of New Testament studies at Northern Seminary. He's a prolific author. I was looking today at how many books you have out now, Dr. Gupta, and how many books you have coming out. And on top of that, you're a co-host of a podcast called Slow Theology.
Yep.
And so I've been looking forward to this, and there's so much that we could talk about and so many things that we could go into, and especially with some of your most recent writings. But you have a new writing that's coming out. I've had the opportunity to read, so I've appreciated that, called Strange Religion, how the early Christians were strange and weird and all that stuff within their context. And so thank you for coming on the podcast. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Nice to meet you. And I know you've had a lot of great guests. So I'm honored to be here.
This is, I think, going to be really informative in how you've presented the book overall. And some of the things that we can talk about that's going on in the early church for the early Christians, how that would have looked in their context. But just straight off, what compelled you to write a book like this and to write a book on this subject matter?
Sure. It's when you look back on something you've been working on a few years, you kind of realize there's more than you start to realize what's kind of in you and all the different reasons why you write something. So, kind of the thing that started it might be the academic questions. And the academic question was, I wrote a book called Paul and the Language of Faith. And one of the things I mentioned in that book is one of the names that the early Christians called themselves early on was believers, right? They called themselves holy ones or saints. They called themselves brothers and sisters, and they called themselves believers because the name Christian doesn't seem to have been used until later, 30, 40, 50 years after Christianity starts, what they call themselves. And so I kind of mentioned in that older book, hey, they called themselves believers. And someone asked me once in a lecture, did other ancient religious groups call themselves believers? And also, when Christians called themselves believers, how did that make them distinctive? Because wasn't everybody a believer in something? If you worshiped Jupiter or if you worshiped Aphrodite, didn't you believe in some things? Why did the Christians call themselves believers? Aren't everybody believers? And that, so then I started to say, okay, if we just take Roman religion, which is kind of what I focus on in the book, which would be kind of state religion, what you're expected to do at festivals and ceremonies. And I just started to kind of make a basic comparison between early Christianity and Roman religion. And Raleigh, I can't tell you how blown away I was just by how weird Christians were. Now, when I use the weird, I'm using it in the really technical sense of not normative.
Right.
Meaning they just don't follow the sort of norms and rules of society. Right? So think about that with like clothing. Right, we have certain expectations of how, there's some variety there, but people wear shirt and pants, right? You wear top and bottom. We have certain expectations about clothing. We have certain expectations about, how we behave in a restaurant or how we behave in public. Christians just seem to defy pretty much every category. So let me give you a couple examples. If I were to come to you and say, Raleigh, I have this great idea. I want to start a school, but we're not going to have students, teachers, textbooks, or classrooms. You would say, what's a school then? Because this is what a school is, right? And the early Christians didn't have the basic building blocks of known religion at the time. So, for example, material sacrifices,
right?
Formal priests, right? Temples. And and idols, or Roman scholars would say cult statues.
Right.
These were the fundamental building blocks of if you were going to start a religion, or if you're going to bring a religion into the Roman Empire. These are the real basic things. And the Christians didn't have them. So from the academic side, that was really interesting to me. And I just wanted to be like, okay, will it help us to understand who Christians are by understanding the kind of world they emerged in, and over and against what was available at the time? Okay, pause on that. At the same time as I was thinking about that, you had the pandemic. And I live in Portland, Oregon. I talk about that in the book. And, the world kind of stopped, and churches had to pivot to online. And so number one, you had to convince people, which was pretty easy to do early on because no one had anything else to do. But as the months and months rolled on, it became tedious. People started to wonder, I think this is actually good. People started to wonder, why do I watch church?
Right.
Is it for a sermon? Because I could do that anytime, doesn't have to be live. Is it for music? I could listen to the radio. And you start to wonder, okay, what is it about church? And then combine that with the fact that when people start going back to church after vaccination, all that, a lot of people can go back.
Yeah.
And I think the general sentiment where I live was, I learned to live without church, and then I realized I could live without church. This is a real problem.
Yeah.
Because if people don't have a reason to go to church, then Christianity offers them nothing. Now I don't like consumerism and the way we consumerize Christianity, and I talk about that in the book.
Sure.
But Christianity hasn't distinguished itself from what quote unquote culture offers. And I don't think Christianity has to bend over backwards and try to entertain and come here and got the best thing in town. But it really raises the question, if Christians were so weird in their own time, in an attractive way, why are they not like that now?
Yeah.
And that's under the surface in my book the whole time. Is, and I just wrote down some thoughts as I was thinking about this interview. One of the thoughts I had was, would ancient Christians recognize us as their spiritual children? Would they recognize us as their spiritual children? And maybe in some ways, but by and large, no.
Right.
Right. And it's ultimately and we can come back to this over and over again, but it's as I've been thinking about what the impact I want my book to have on people is really a question of culture. Yeah, there's a whole lot of New Testament theology in the book. There's a lot of ancient history, weird history, but it really comes down to the question, what drives Christian culture? Is it driven by Jesus Christ and the gospel? Or is it driven by popular culture?
Yeah.
Now, it's not to say Christians can't learn from popular culture.
Sure.
I think we can learn some things. But I think ultimately it comes down to that question, is what's the driving force of what makes us behave and think in the ways that we do as Christians?
Yeah, and so what I got from the book and what you're saying now is it's very ecclesial in just its framework. And so it's interesting, as I'm hearing you talk, one of our other pastors here at the church, he had this idea for, instead of this Sunday preaching a sermon, which is normative, right, for all of us, that why not just have some kind of coffee table discussion about some of these same things that you're pointing out? Like, why do we do this thing that we call church? If you can do church to begin with, but even the framework of what is the church? Why is it different than other just gatherings that we have? And what's going on in our services? Why do we structure our services the way that we structure them, particularly here at the congregation over whom I shepherd? And so we're at a lot of those questions that you're raising here resonate with me because I'm thinking through the same things towards my congregation. Of we've by and large, and correct me if you disagree with this, but by and large, we have turned our services into something that looks a lot like a great TED Talk, that has music that hopefully is very good and people enjoy, whether the lyrics and the theology behind the songs is terrible or not. As long as the music is good, we're just going to sing our hearts out. And so the way that it looks is really like, and I've had people even say this at certain churches I've been to, is it felt like a concert with a TED Talk.
Right.
And I think that that's pretty normative, and because we're trying to appeal to a culture instead of being strange or a little odd within a culture. So as I was reading your book, all of these thoughts come rushing into my mind. And what you say is they weren't weird for the sake of being weird.
Right. No.
That this was not an issue. Like you speak a lot about the weirdness of Christianity within the Roman culture.
Uh-huh.
But since Christianity starts with its origins in a Jewish religion, how is it weird in the Jewish religion sense? Because St. Paul seems to be like pressing into how Christianity is the same and different in a lot of his writings. And so if this is a fair question for you, how then is Christianity strange or weird within Judaism and within the Roman Empire at the time that come together?
Yeah, there are a couple of landmines that I was worried about when I wrote this book in terms of really delicate things that I wanted to. When I emailed my editor after I finished the book, I told him, if people are gonna go after me, they're gonna go after me about things. One is I undersell the weirdness of Judaism. And so I was trying to be really careful about expressing how weird Judaism is, and I'll talk about that in a moment.
Yep.
And then also Christian exceptionalism, this idea that Christians were perfect. So I actually have a chapter called the first Christians were not perfect.
Right.
Because I didn't want to make it seem like they were perfect, because they weren't. And I do think Christianity is exceptional, but I understand people's concerns when they talk about American exceptionalism or biblical exceptionalism, all that. Okay, so you asked, so let me start with this. This is a little bit tangential, but I think it relates to your question. Christians were weird, but Jews were also weird in their own Roman world for a few reasons. One is they only worshipped one God.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's the kind of dominant view today because of Islam, Christianity, Judaism. There are Hindus out there. My parents are Hindus. There are Hindus out there that worship a lot of gods. So polytheism isn't, too strange in terms of the number of people today that worship multiple gods.
Mm-hmm.
But monotheism is dominant, but you have to understand the ancient world, monotheism was not only the exception, but it would have been seen as really problematic.
Right.
So let me explain a little bit about how the Roman Empire worked. So the Roman Empire had sort of the dominant gods, the Olympians, right? These were seen as kind of the protectors of the Roman state, the Roman Empire. But Rome, generally speaking, had a tolerance policy for other religions. If you came in as an immigrant and you brought in your ancestral religion, that was fine as long as it could integrate into the Roman system.
Right.
It had to play nice. Right. So if you have your little, statue of the Egyptian god Isis or a picture, you got to put, Jupiter next to her, or you got to put the picture of the emperor and kiss it, next to Isis. That was fine. But the Jews didn't like that. They said, we cannot have any graven images. Also, in Roman religion, Rome was really important, but you could have temples to any deity just about anywhere. You might have it in a really special place where that deity was appeared once, or where they did some special ceremony. But you had an Aphrodite temple in 20 different cities. It's pretty common.
Right.
Jews, generally speaking, the majority of Jews throughout time have treated Jerusalem with the utmost reverence. You can worship God anywhere, and you had synagogues in various places. But, Josephus, ancient historian, famously said there's one temple because there's one God.
Right.
one house of God, right? So Jews were a little bit weird for having one temple. They were also weird for not having a cult statue. So you go into the Holy of Holies, and there's nothing there. And there's a famous story of the Roman general Pompey, who had heard there was no cult statue, and it would be desecrating the temple for a pagan, for a Gentile to enter. And he entered into it, desecrating it, because he was really curious. And he went in there and he looked around. And he said, "I'll be darned, there's no cult statue," and he left. And this became a famous story because other people throughout time did that as well. You know, like the Greek Syrian tyrant Antiochus.
Yeah.
And they were just really shocked that they didn't have these images. So Jews were weird, but they had a few things going for them that really helped sell them to the Romans in terms of tolerance. One is the antiquity of their religion. They could say, we go back to Abraham. And this was a long, long, long time ago, right? Also, this idea of God being invisible and God being an all-powerful deity. These things were really attractive to the Romans. Oh, he's got to be really strong because we don't know what he looks like. He's invisible. He lives in heaven. They thought there was a lot of things going for them. Now, Christians took a lot of those things to an extreme. So the idea of, okay, Jews have one temple. We don't have any temples at all. Now, they did until they worshipped in relationship to the Jerusalem temple until it was destroyed in some way.
Sure.
Well, it's interesting if you read Paul's letters, Raleigh, it's from the lens that I'm talking about. None of the apostles in the New Testament letters actually talk about going on pilgrimage to Jerusalem.
Right.
That is fascinating because all ancient people went somewhere to be closer to a deity.
Right.
It was just common, just like, Taylor Swift Eras Tour, right? If you want to be a part of the fun, you got to show up. Yes, there's a movie, but it's not the same. And so if you want to be a part of the action, you got to sit in line and show up.
Right.
Right? You got to pay, X number of thousands of dollars, and you got to show up if you want to be a part of the action. If you want to say, I was there. And Christians don't have any, I was there, except I have seen the Lord Jesus. And that was a one-time thing. Right? And so, so Jews were weird. Christians were even weirder because their God was invisible. But then also, Jews could say we have Yahweh. They wouldn't say that. They would say we have Adonai.
Sure.
And they revere this invisible God. And Christians say we revere a Jewish criminal.
Right.
Someone convicted of a crime, crucified on a cross. Right? I mean, that's a hard sell.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially like within the Roman world and what it meant to be hung on a cross in the Romans, completely shameful, demoralizing, dehumanizing, like the whole thing and that's who Christians grab onto, rightfully so, but that's who we grab onto as not just the Israelite Messiah or Israel's Messiah to come, but Kyrios, the Lord of the universe. And which is, a very political statement within their context that makes maybe Christians even more strange but provocative in their context. To say that Jesus is Lord is to say that Caesar is not, which is like the ultimate no within Roman culture, especially when veneration of the Caesars starts coming around with Octavian or Augustus and those types of things. And so, there are several, and I've appreciated that there are several things that separate Christians from Judaism itself. It hinges on Jesus being Messiah, crucified, died, resurrected, and ascended. But there are other things as well that happen within Christendom that are different than Judaism as well, and the temple becomes like that centralizing thing. You get that narrative in Jesus with the woman at the well. You're no longer going to worship in Jerusalem, the temple, and pushing forth in this idea that the church then itself becomes the temple. So that's strange in and of itself that there's no physical temple, but there is kind of a physical temple when God's people are gathered together. They are the temple that the Spirit of God God himself, the invisible God, indwells. And so there's all kind of strange language that's going on that the New Testament writers are grabbing onto, these physical ideas that become invisible realities, so to speak, but even though they're tangible in some ways. And then I think another thing that's really fascinating here, in just in history in general, the idea of eating somebody's flesh and drinking somebody's blood within the Roman culture, and they're like, what are these weird things? And then they're having like these big incestual romance gatherings, and they're eating babies. Well, the issue of the babies and Christians adopting babies, like all within that society, and like what. Like, it does seem strange, and we should read, at least in some way, and go, this was really provocative within a Roman culture, but that's really provocative within any culture that doesn't understand what Christians are talking about. And so it's really interesting. So can we come back to the language of belief? And when we say that we're believers, what exactly are Christians saying that other religions in general, but particularly within antiquity, are saying or are not saying?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so much. It opens just this cornucopia of interconnections within the Bible, but with faith language. I think you kind of have to start with how Romanized people thought about religion. Book is, I kind of stumbled across a scholar today, couple scholars who made the same argument, that Roman religion was science, not belief. And I thought, what are they talking about? What they were saying is, if you ordain, they wouldn't use the word ordain, consecrate a Roman priest, right? On what basis are you choosing the Roman priest? Usually they're people of the elite class, the senatorial class. And they're not chosen because they're religious or spiritual or moral. They're chosen because they're high class, they're wealthy, and they're important. But also because it's believed they can perform the Roman rituals correctly to achieve the proper outcome. So you had a variety of certain rituals that you would do to try to win favor with the gods. In my book, I talk about the ultimate Roman goal of pax deorum, peace with the gods. Ultimately, this is what Rome wanted in religion, what I call religio, which is their normal word for religion. What they didn't want nirvana. They didn't care much about the afterlife. They didn't care about Jesus in my heart, personal fulfillment. They wanted peace with the gods and not wrath. That's what they wanted. And so you wanted a priest who would perform the particular rituals in a way that they would achieve that result of peace and not wrath. So let me give you one of my favorite examples. I talk about this in the book. There's a Roman ritual called tripudium, which relates to chickens. And if you were going to go into war, you had certain priests who were qualified to interpret the movement of sacred chickens. So what you do is you would put some food in front of these sacred chickens, and if they ate with voracious appetite, that would be a positive omen,
right?
That you were going to win whatever battle, whatever. But if they were not hungry and they didn't eat at it, that was a bad sign. And you relied on these priests to interpret all this. But there's a famous story of this Navy hero, Claudius Pulcher, who was going to war against the Carthaginians, and he took the chickens on this war vessel, and he put the food in front of them, and they wouldn't eat. Chickens wouldn't eat. And he got so mad, he picked up chickens and he threw them overboard. And he said, if they will not eat, let them drink, meaning let them drown in the water.
Seems right.
Love that story. Poor Claudius Pulcher lost against the Carthaginians. But that just shows you, belief didn't play a big part in Roman religion because it didn't really matter what you believed. It mattered whether you respected the gods. So if you went and made a sacrifice, but then you went home and said, I don't believe in Jupiter, Jupiter doesn't care. Jupiter doesn't care what you believe as long as you're obedient, right? But here's the thing about Christians, and I'll get back to belief language in a second.
Yeah.
looked up how many times Christians talk about the heart.
Yeah.
Now, you get this in the Old Testament, so definitely bears tribute to that. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all of that.
Hmm.
But early Christians were obsessed with what you actually believe in your heart.
Right.
So if a Christian was sitting down with a Roman and said, what does Jupiter think about your heart? The Roman would say, he doesn't care about the heart. The Christian would say, but that's really who you are. You are who you are on the inside, and that comes out,
Mm-hmm.
right? And a Roman just couldn't make much of that if they were really committed to their practices.
Right.
So let's get to belief. I think a few reasons why Christians really focused on the language of belief. One is Jesus talked a lot about belief, right? Your faith has made you well. Repent and believe in the good news, right? He talks about believing in himself. He talks about believing in the kingdom of God. I think it's really about allegiance. I credit yours and my friend Matthew Bates for really popularizing the importance of thinking about faith as allegiance and not just mental assent or signing a doctrinal statement, which it's great to sign doctrinal statements, but mental assent isn't allegiance. Allegiance is a fully embodied thing. I think a second reason is you had Jesus come, die, rise again, and ascend, and he's not there anymore. And you don't have cult statues, so it takes faith, right, to trust in this person you can't see. Hebrews 11.
Right.
But it's being sure. It's being sure, right? 1 Peter, I think 1:9. You believe even though you haven't, seen him. You love him as well, and it's also about the future. Right? Christians believe that God is going to come back in the future. But here's where I think belief is really important, Raleigh, and this matters to your listeners, I think. Christians did not believe that suffering meant the displeasure of God. Now, a lot of people in the Roman world believe that if something bad happened, that this must be the displeasure of the gods. And Christians, they weren't fully against that idea, but they believed that your circumstances don't tell the story of how God feels about you, how he thinks about you, how he's working in the world, and how he's going to work in the world.
Right.
The Christians didn't make a cause and effect association between bad things in the world and the goodness of God or the pleasure of God. One of my favorite texts, Philippians chapter 1, where he says, has been given to you as grace from God, not just to believe in him, but to suffer for his sake.
Right.
And that's something I think Romans can understand is maybe suffering isn't God being against you, God challenging you to face hardship in his name. I think these were all baked in together with this recipe of what it meant to what I call believe the unbelievable.
Right.
Christians were willing to believe the unbelievable. And I think that stands as a challenge to us today. Are we willing to believe the unbelievable? Right? I was just listening to a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. I was reading a quote from 60 years ago where he says, we can't let the isms of today blind us to the oughtness of what God wants for our future. I'm paraphrasing. But I love the isms of today, the isness of today.
Yeah.
Christians live not by the isness of today, but the oughtness of what the kingdom of God is all about. He promises for the future that we can take hold of today. I love that. That's Christianity.
Right.
That's what the early Christians believed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. You said so many things in there that that are just beautiful. And so I'll touch on a couple and maybe we can expound upon them a little bit. But when you're talking about this idea of suffering and in Greek culture and Roman culture, even in Jewish culture, I mean, we see some of these ideas in the Old Testament in certain ways, but which I think is why Paul has to address some of the issues of don't be ashamed of me because I'm in prison. This is not working out for my evil, but for your good. That I'm here. And so we have all these ideas that he's suffering for the sake of Christ, so that his audience, his readers shouldn't be ashamed that he's suffering, which would be a shameful thing to be in prison. Like, this is not a thing that is a good thing, really, in anybody's mind. Maybe the reason for it could be positive or negative, but So I find that really interesting when I'm reading the Pauline corpus of how often he's encouraging his readers not to be dismayed because of the shame that has befallen him, because it's not shame, it's actually honor from the Lord that he's receiving in some way, because it's going to be to their benefit, to their good, and which is just so profound in a world that views suffering that nothing good comes out of it, and
Right.
that you had to have done something for the God. I mean, you get this in Job. What in the world did you do that God has done this to you? I mean,
Yeah.
so this
Yeah.
is laced like this idea of, and I know karma is much bigger than this, but this idea of you're going to get what you give, or what you put out in
Right.
the world is going to come back to you, or all of those kinds of things. And the Christian story is no. Yes, suffering may be bad in and of itself, but God redeems that suffering to bring about good for maybe not you necessarily in your present circumstance. But then when you talk about this idea of living as if the eschaton were now, and in a sense, we are living in the last days where God is renewing, and He's brought about this renewal project of His creation. Which is another thing I want to get to about the gods and being in their own space, human being in their own space, and the Christian God wanting to bring space together. So maybe we could talk about that as well. But when we approach the idea that suffering won't last forever, there is a sense that, okay, if God is going to do away with all this, and every tear is going to be wiped away from all eyes, and death will be no more, suffering and pain will be no more, all of these things, we can look at it on the one hand and say suffering is not good. But how powerful and how magnificent and how lovely is the God who can take what is evil and redeem it and bring about good. Like, there's just something so incredible about the God who is, when we start understanding what the New Testament language particularly is getting at in some of that. And it's just so powerful and hopeful in the Christian life, and what Christians from very early on, particularly with the teaching of the apostles, that seem to be like shaping that idea, that may have been misunderstood, whether it was in Judaism or within their cultural setting of the gods being angry with them, not doing the things that the gods wanted them to do. So now they're in this predicament of suffering or whatever, making the gods mad, or any of that. You mentioned Dr. Bates, and so I'll touch on that real quick, and then I'd love for you to respond to some of that. I found it interesting that in his book, Living the Good News of King Jesus with Purpose, he actually quotes you speaking about Pistis.
Right.
And this idea of, I have the quote here, it's obeying faith is relationally active. Faithfulness is understood in the discussion as an active form of loyalty or obedience. And this is really, I think, the essence of what Dr. Bates is trying to get at with allegiance. And if we think of Jesus as king, if we think of God as king, allegiance just comes naturally in faith language. But I think maybe some of the issue that we have encountered in our present culture, one, monarchies aren't the biggest thing anymore. We have all these democracies and republics and things that are different than an understanding of monarchy. But beyond that, we've made Jesus just like our friend, our brother. Jesus is my boyfriend, he's my homeboy kind of idea, to where allegiance to that kind of person sounds really messed up, or it doesn't even make sense, right?
Right. Yeah. I think part of the problem is how culturally watered down the language of faith is. And so, one of my favorite TV shows last few years is Ted Lasso. I'm a big Ted Lasso fan, especially season one.
Okay.
But, you have the poster Believe, this iconic poster.
Right.
Okay, but believe in what? Believe in myself, believe that I can win. I don't know. Like, it's kind of faith in faith, or belief in belief. And
Yeah.
that's not what Jesus was talking about at all. So it really is fixated on the person of Jesus, right? And then the question is, have we gotten Jesus right?
Right.
There's been a lot of talk in the study of the historical Jesus over the last 100 years, especially over the last 50 years, about how we just tried to study Jesus to make Jesus look more like me.
Right.
If if I'm a liberal Democrat, then guess what? I'm going to discover liberal Democrat Jesus.
Yep.
If I'm, Republican, I'm going to discover Republican Jesus. Like he's going to look like me, and he's going to sound like me and talk like me and value the things I value. There's some danger in that. So we need to make sure we're reading the New Testament, the earliest Christian tradition, the kind of orthodoxy of Christianity, to really understand who Jesus is from what he said and what the Gospels say about him, first and foremost, and the Bible, the New Testament as a whole. And so, I do get concerned about how we use faith language in a very detached way from not only the person of Jesus, but what Jesus really stands for. There's been a lot of talk, we're recording here in January. There's been a lot of talk about Martin Luther King Jr., what his legacy is, who he is. I don't want to go on that. I admire King. But, I hear a lot of criticism right now against King, criticizing his legacy, criticizing his actions. And the best thing to do is to go back and actually read, what did King say? What did King do? Rather than just to sit around and complain or argue about it. Same thing with Jesus. Let's actually go back and look at what Jesus said and look what Jesus did. The things that I'm seeing online that people say and do in the name of Jesus is really scary.
Yeah.
It's really scary one way or another, because people are kind of co-opting Jesus into their own agenda. And I don't know if this will help, but I'm going to throw this out there. You could tell me if I'm getting off track. But I wish I would have put this in the book. But people have asked me, if you had to identify the fingerprint of Roman religion, what made Roman religion a cultural influence versus early Christianity? So I just came up with these kind of counterpoints. Tell me what you think, if this is helpful to the conversation.
Sure.
So if I were to boil Roman religion down to three things, I would say power, fear, and hierarchy. So power meaning there was this pyramid of power in the Roman world, right? And the fewest people were at the top of the most power. So that's the Olympian gods, the demigods, the emperor, the senatorial class, and then you go down and you have middle class. I didn't really have middle class.
Sure.
But you have commoners, slaves, the large number of slaves, large number of immigrants, and so a few people at the top, right? A lot of people at the bottom. And Roman religion tried to reinforce that, right? Number two, fear, right? If you didn't obey, you didn't fall in line, you were gonna get in trouble, right? And Roman religion reinforced that. And number three, hierarchy. Right? You fit into a specific spot on the ladder of power, and you better know where you fit, and you better stay there.
Right.
Now, and we know that partly through Rome's obsession with conquest. And the fact they want to expand and conquer other lands. And the way religion tied in, this is really fascinating. There was this Roman ritual called evocatio, where when a general went on a hill about to siege a city, they'd actually call out to the patron god of that city. And they would say, hey, listen, Apollo of Tyre, I'm about to destroy the city. I'm inviting you now to leave this city, give up your protection of the city, come join my crew. I'll get a nice seat for you in the pantheon. Otherwise, when we come through, we're going to destroy, your temple, your seat as well. And there's all these stories from antiquity of gods fleeing the city because they don't want to be on the losing side.
Right.
So this was about power, conquest, fear, hierarchy. This is what Roman religion reinforced. Now let's look at the Christians. If I had to boil it down to three things, and this just reflects my reading of the New Testament. Number one, they took the context of religion out of the sphere of government. The gods are like magistrates,
right?
And they put it in the sphere of family. Don't think of God as a terrorizing emperor. Think of God as a loving parent. Number one, that's, think about the most common language used for God in the Bible, Father.
Yeah.
Think about the most common language used for Jesus, Lord and Son, right? Second, and I talk about this in my book, instead of fear, the primary dynamic in the New Testament is love.
Yeah.
This is completely absent from Roman religion.
Mm-hmm.
Gods don't care at all if you love them. Now, they might have sex with you, and that's a
Right.
whole other subject. But in terms of what we think of as love, as pure and affectionate and tender, that would be dangerous.
Yeah.
That would get you in trouble
Yeah.
because you're mixing too closely with the gods. It's volatile. But this is the dominant way that Jews and Christians have looked at God, as someone to love. The ultimate expression of faith is love.
Mm.
And number 3, instead of hierarchy, Christianity represents cruciformity, which involves mutuality, service, humility, and equality. So some of your listeners might not know what cruciformity is.
Mm-hmm.
It's the idea of imitating the kind of discipleship and obedience that Jesus demonstrates when he willingly sacrifices himself out of love for others,
Right.
especially his enemies.
Right.
Mutuality, humility, service, equality. And I have a whole chapter there focusing on Christian focus on the home.
Yeah.
I used to think Christians chose homes because that was convenient. Maybe, but they built a whole theology around that.
Yeah.
Right? You have a meal like you would do in a home. You call each other brother and sister. You have a holy, sacred kiss. And the kiss isn't a sexual kiss. It's kind of like the hug that you would give if you saw a family member or a close friend after a long time not seeing them.
Right.
Like that kind of, oh my gosh. Like I don't know how old you are. I'm guessing you're in your 30s or 40s. But if you remember the time when people at the airport could come to the gates to greet you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
I remember how nice it felt to get off the plane.
And there you loved
And
ones,
there were
right?
people standing there with signs saying, "Welcome home, Raleigh.
Yeah.
We've missed you." And imagine the hugs and kisses there. That's what the kind of base understanding of this kiss was, that you're family.
Right.
Like you love one another. And so this was different than a lot of the fear elements and professional distance that was involved in, and I'm stereotyping here Roman religion, I'm stereotyping early Christianity.
Sure.
Okay, quick reactions to that.
There's several things in there that I think can be important for the way that we understand who we are in Christ, and I think you're absolutely right. That familial language of father, brother, sister, and how Christianity just is at its core different in response to the God who is, and how Christianity through Christ is able to approach God, which makes it utterly distinctive from any other religion, even Judaism at that point, because to approach God, to offer sacrifices, which can't happen anymore, and so there are other things that are going on within that there's. So there's something really beautiful about the familial language within Christianity that I find can also be quite dangerous, and meaning we can become apathetic to who God is, in the sense of like I'm now I got to count and remember. Hold on. I'm 42. So my dad is one of my best friends. Like I have a close, beautiful relationship with both my mom and my dad. There's still a healthy respect that I have. My dad I don't treat my dad like I treat my other friends. I think what happens when we say hierarchy within relationship or something like that, then God just becomes on the same level as we are to some. And so there shouldn't be, but there is a danger I've found as a pastor to talking about, well, Christians don't believe in any hierarchy. I know that's not what you're saying, or at least I don't think that's what you're saying. But I think when people start to hear, well, Christianity breaks down all of the hierarchy, it's like, well, in a sense, Christianity's promoting equality. There's no longer Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free. Like, And so we're coming together as one within this thing, and some of the abusive hierarchical relationships are torn down. I mean, we could talk about slavery. We could talk about men and women relationships within the Bible. We can talk about why Paul doesn't abolish slavery. But at least in my opinion, what we can talk about within those relationships, particularly in Ephesians, when Paul gives this great riff about what we call the household codes. But when he gets to masters and slaves, he starts off by telling slaves to be obedient to your masters, and he goes on this, and then he turns to the masters and says, do the same thing to your slaves. So what would that relationship look like? There's still in Paul's mind that you're still a slave to your master, but there's a brotherhood or a brother sisterhood that comes, that relationship would not look like a master servant relationship if it's done appropriately. And same thing with like parents and children. Right, there is in a sense a hierarchy between parents and children. Honor your father and mother, and all of that kind of stuff. And so, which is beautiful and healthy, and actually I think informs the way that we should understand who God is as Father, and the respect that needs to be shown to Him. And even though fear is not the principle there, but love is the principle. But love recognizes, I think, in some ways, the ultimate being who is deserving of love, who embodies love, who has projected love into His creation. And if we were to think about God in those terms, not in fear, I find this interesting. Proverbs, the fear is the beginning of knowledge. Fear becomes the beginning of wisdom. Perfect love casts out fear. So if fear is the beginning, love is the telos. And that just seems to work so well together within the Christian narrative that we don't have to approach God in fear because of Christ Jesus. We can approach God in utter love and in due respect for who He is, who He's created us to be in light of that.
Yeah, let me respond to a few of those things. Good comments and questions. Let me just say, there are different kinds of fear, and fear can be a really good thing. My wife and I and my family just went to the Grand Canyon for the first time, and you get close to the edge. You know, there's no rails anywhere. You get close to the edge, and it's just like, it's beautiful and it's terrifying.
Right.
Because if I fall, like, I'm going to die. And so there's this kind of fear that is just a natural reaction to stepping in the presence of greatness.
Right.
And that's good, as opposed to a terrorizing fear.
Right.
And God isn't to be feared in that way, but God is to be feared in the sense that He is great.
Yeah.
And amazing. So I think fear and love can coexist. And the hierarchy thing, you're right, I should have clarified. God is of a whole different order as the creator than we are as creatures. But among creatures, I don't think early Christianity believed in hierarchy as much as leadership. I think leadership would be the way we would use the language of leadership. Now, when it comes to things like, well, let me put it this way. What was different about Christians? They didn't immediately change the systems. Right? Whether it was slavery or patronage, they didn't immediately swear off. They did say you shouldn't be a slave trader, things like that. But what I would say is at the heart of the transformation of the West is the idea of the inherent dignity and sameness of every creature, every human creature. And this just wasn't a common belief in the Roman world, right? Criminals, slaves, foreigners were seen, and women were seen as lesser than. And in a really dehumanizing way. And something that couple things really reminded me of that, Raleigh. One is watching a TV show called A Small Light. It's a National Geographic show about the people that were helping to hide the Anne Frank family, Meep Geese. You should watch it. It's incredible. It's called A Small Light. And it really shows you how people could think of Jews as inferior creatures. I mean, it really gets you really in there. Yeah, obviously we have Schindler's List and things, but this is a whole TV show, and it really gets you into it to the point where you can see how people caught on to this idea. And I'll tell you what, I think we're starting to live in America that is creating that kind of atmosphere where something like that could happen again. Let me give an example. You know how you're on YouTube, things will show up because you tend to search for certain things. Well, I searched once for an incident I saw on TikTok or something where a parent beat up a ref, a sports ref at one of their kids' games. And then it comes up now with all these kinds of stories, and they happen a lot. And I watch these, and it seems to be growing.
Yeah.
There's a growing commonality in the last few years. I'd say, last 7-8 years. There's a growing trend of parents beating up high school.
It's insane.
Refs, like soccer, football, what you call, you name it, basketball.
Yeah.
And what is behind this? What is behind this? To me, it has something to do with dehumanization. Right? Couple things. One is just internet, social media, but another thing is just the echo chambers, the distancing within culture means that I don't see that person as someone that is just like me. I don't see them as just like me.
Right.
They are on the opposite side, and therefore they're not human, and therefore I could, put them in the hospital.
Right. Yeah.
Because they didn't officiate the game in the direction of my kid. I mean, it's bewildering.
Yeah.
It's bewildering to me. But can you see how if a culture doesn't have an attitude of sameness for all people, right? How that's possible.
Right.
And here the Christians come, and Jesus starts to teach about the Good Samaritan.
Right.
And the hero is the enemy.
What an utterly provocative, it's just incredible. Yeah.
Or Paul's letter to Philemon, this gets into the
Right.
question of slavery.
Right.
I wish that Paul would have abolished slavery? Of course I wish he would have. That'd be amazing.
Right.
He doesn't. He has his reasons. We could talk about that later. But what he does say to the Christian slaveholder Philemon about the Christian slave Onesimus, he says, welcome him as you would welcome me.
Treat
Now,
him like
Paul
you would
is
treat me. Yeah.
the apostle of Gentiles. He's a big deal. He says in 1 Thessalonians, we could have thrown our weight around as apostles, meaning I'm a big deal.
Right.
And he's saying, what would you do if I showed up at your house? You would go to the store and get lobster.
Yeah.
And steak.
Yeah.
Right? You'd break out the good wine. You would roll out the red carpet. Right? Do that for this slave. This slave.
Right.
There are these famous stories. There's a good famous story. I put this in the book where the emperor is having dinner as a dinner party at kind of a statesman, a kind of, wealthy upper crust statesman. And a slave breaks a glass and in front of the emperor by accident. And the master is so embarrassed, he actually grabs the slave and is about to throw him into a pool of eels, kind of like an exotic pool of eels. And the emperor, forgives and pardons that.
Yeah.
But that's how people treated slaves. They're dispensable. They're discardable. They're worth punishing. They're worth selling. And here Paul is saying, as a Christian, to a Christian, about a Christian, forgive him, whatever he did, or let it go if he didn't do anything, and treat him like you would treat me. To me, there's nothing more anti-Roman
Right.
than Paul saying, treat this slave who's disenfranchised, is estranged from you, treat him just like you treat me, give him hospitality and warmth the way you treat me. That was completely anti-Roman.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. And has so many implications within our situatedness that we could think through in how we treat people.
Mm.
Because I think, well, at least I'll speak for myself and not for anyone else, but I have the tendency that when somebody who like really means something comes over, that, you know, we pull out the stops, you know,
Yeah.
and we do certain things. And then when somebody is, for lack of a better understanding, but from our perspective, just, you know, a normal person, whatever, coming over, maybe somebody that can't do anything for you or, you know, increase you in any way that you perceive, you know, we might get McDonald's or something. Nothing against McDonald's. I'm not trying to. I eat McDonald's often. Somebody gave me a gift card for Christmas, so that's
Confession.
not, right. But there is this sense that, and I find really interesting what Paul says after that. Like, hey, get my room ready because I'm going to show up soon. We're going to see how Onesimus was treated here in just a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. When we start to break ourselves down, and I know this whole movement of like servant leadership and all of these terms are brought out now to try to convey what we're trying to say in terms of the Christian leader, whether a pastor or an elder in a church or a deacon or whatever, that's really an in the mud servant position. That is now that service is going to look like leadership in the way that we're moving people towards Christ likeness and guiding people in those ways. But for Paul, over and over again, his identification is a slave to Jesus Christ, doing the work that Jesus himself left for the apostles to do. And which comes in the Philippians hymn of giving himself for the creation, condescending his heavenly throne to take on the form of the lowest of humanity. Now, he wasn't a literal slave, and like he didn't come as a slave to somebody in particular, but the way that he operates within humanity, the God of the universe condescending to take on flesh, to be with his creation, to serve them in the utmost way, to bring about deliverance. And then you think of Moses and all of that kind of language of that looks like a magnified leader. But if we are sitting on the ground level of this, it looks like a servant who's serving people. And there's just something utterly incredible about the God who would do that in the midst of Greek mythology and the gods, or Roman mythology and the pantheon, and there's no other God like him. You just don't have that same kind of thing. And we could go back again, and I don't want to keep you too long. I want to be respectful of your time. But one of the things that strikes me, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, is the gods of the Roman pantheon were perfectly content. It's probably not nearly as forceful to say it, to be in the heavens, to be in their own realm, to visit or to visit Earth every now and then when it suited them, whenever they wanted to do something or whatever. But the God of creation, the God who is utterly opposite of that. That
Right.
instead of wanting to be away from the people and from creation, from the world, he's operating from page 1 to the last page of the scriptures to bring those two things together. And there's just something utterly remarkable when we're thinking about the differences of the Roman gods and like the provocation of Christians saying some of the things that they were saying within that atmosphere is just utterly mind-blowing. And so if you could, before you go, could you talk a little bit in our context, how understanding the Roman world and how the Christians were strange and weird in that cultural societal context could invoke a faithful response in our situatedness here, 21st century, and in different cultures and in cultural norms and all of that kind of stuff?
Oh man, we need a couple more hours for that, but I'll just give a couple tastes of what I would love, the kind of conversations I'd love to see happen. I think, what happened with the church growth movement, the attractional movement, is this idea that if we sing and dance and we entertain, we're going to draw in the masses, then we can tell them about Jesus.
Right.
But and I don't mind. I don't think a megachurch is bad all by itself. I've seen larger. My friend AJ Swoboda, who's my co-host, he says there are bad small churches, there are bad large churches. So I take that to heart. But one of the challenges is if your key diagnostic of whether church is going well is numbers and popularity, that's a cultural statement. That's a statement about who you are as a church. Right. And so, I teach pastors. I'm a seminary professor. I'd love to ask them, how do you know on Monday whether you had a good week at church last week? How do you know?
Yeah.
Like, what are you talking about with your church? Is it, did people feel pumped up? Is it that, the parking lot was full? Is it that you're doing a capital campaign expanding? Like, what are you, and to me, question. And I know this is the old story, but are people growing closer to Jesus Christ?
Right.
Are they looking more and more like Jesus Christ? Let me give an example. Like, recently we've had a lot of the awards ceremonies, Golden Globes and Emmys and all that. And one thing I love to watch, in the morning I have a cup of coffee, and sometimes I'll watch like a 10-minute YouTube clip. And I watch, sometimes I love watching Lifetime Achievement Awards. You got someone who's been doing their good work for, 30, 40 years. Imagine if every Sunday was a Lifetime Achievement Award for Jesus Christ. And this is why we show up.
Right.
We show up
to sell.
Not to be fed. Okay, I love being fed. I love food. No problem there with food. What if we show up because every Sunday is a Lifetime Achievement Award for Jesus Christ?
I think it changes our aspect or our perception of what we're doing.
Yeah. Like, number one, we're here to see the person. Number two, spiritually. And number two, we're here to celebrate the person.
Right.
And number three, we're here to emulate the person.
Yeah.
Right? We say, this is the best of us. This is why we give awards to people. I used to hate award ceremonies because I'm always like, we're just treating them as the privileged person. But I was thinking about this with my son, who, when he had his 8th grade promotion to 9th grade, they had these awards, service awards, things like that. It's not just who's special and who's not. It's that these people showcase and reflect the best values, right? That's the ideal. This is why you clap for them.
Right.
And what if that was what we do on Sunday? What if what we do Sunday is we cheer, we clap, we say, Jesus Christ is the best of us. I mean, every Sunday is like Groundhog Day. We repeat the same thing over and over again. Lifetime Achievement Award.
It makes the whole thing not about us, which is part of the problem, right?
I think that's it. But it is about us in a roundabout way,
right? Because
we want to leave changed by having focused our attention on Jesus.
Right.
It matters what we do outside of church.
Sure.
It matters, church is the outpost gathering that teaches us and infuses in us who God is, so that we can be like God outside of church. But I love what you talked about at the beginning. We might need to break out of the monotony. I love tradition. I think tradition is actually an important part of culture. So I'm not like blow the whole thing up.
Right.
But I do, one of the challenges I face with seminary students is if I say, what is a church and what is a pastor? Usually they give me some sort of answer that is basically whatever the last person that had my job did is what I do.
Right.
And I don't want that to be the answer. I want it to come from the New Testament. I want it to come from the Bible. And so what I hope to come out of my book is basically inspiration from the early Christians. They didn't start with what's already going on in culture and saying, how can we Christianify it? They started with Jesus Christ and said, how can I be the most like this, accepting what I can from what's around me, and yet being weird and different, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
One of the things I want for Christians is to adopt and emulate the resilience the early Christians had.
Right.
It's tough to change one thing, but to change everything is crazy.
Yeah.
Right? It's hard to change one thing. Try changing your service time from 9 to 9:15.
Oh, man. You're trying to get people fired, man.
It's hard. But change everything. Say, we're going to do it differently, but we're going to do it by the book. by the book of Jesus Christ. That's what the early Christians did. The analogy I use in the book is the Pied Piper.
Yeah.
Right? The Pied Piper comes, and these creatures, they don't care what's going on. They're attracted to this music. What if we didn't care what was going on around us and we were just attracted to this music? I don't want that to seem dualistic or like we're going to dig our heads in the sand. I don't want that at all.
Sure.
I just want it to be that we start with Jesus and the apostles, and don't start with what do people want, and how can we slip Jesus into what they want.
Yeah.
That's good. That we've tried that for a long time and that hasn't worked. That hasn't worked in Jesus' favor.
Right. And maybe it gives the trappings of working just enough to where people continue along those lines, to where if we have a lot of people that come, it's got to be working. And then you look at your people. I'll give you one story, and then we'll wrap up here for the sake of your time. But when I was interviewing, so I was an intern here at the church before I interviewed. I never wanted to be a pastor. That was not my trajectory in seminary. And but I was interning here and doing some things. And so when it came time, I was finishing up my seminary career, and the church started asking if I would apply for the pastorate. It had been without an English ministries pastor for about 4 years, and which is not good. And so I'm in the interview, and somebody asked me how I would measure church growth. And I said, well, I don't care about numbers. So if that's the issue, like that's never how I'm going to look at that. What I'm going to look at is, are my people moving into Christ likeness? And that's a slow progression. So it can be like, how do you gauge? Like that's a slow gauge. But I think I have found that there are ways that I can kind of see that working itself out, and it's really beautiful. So anytime I'm ever asked about that, that's the response is like, God's going to take care of the numbers. I'm not worried about that. The beginning of Acts, they weren't worried about that, and then it said God added so many thousand souls to there. Right? Like the issue is not how many people are here, but for myself as a pastor is how am I leading these people to encounter the God who is. And the God who is through his son, Jesus Christ, who reveals the Father, and the teaching of the apostles and prophets who are revealing who God is. And are we encountering him? Do we care about that? And then is that care, is that encounter moving towards obedience, or what we would call allegiance in this movement, or faithfulness to the God who is and what he's calling us to be as people who are his image in the world, and projecting that into the world. And so I think a lot of this was just laced throughout your book and what the early Christians were doing within their cultural context. And it was just, really, really beautiful. And so I'll post links for some of your other writings that can be really beneficial within thinking through this. But I really appreciated the accessibility and some of the humor that's in there, the stories that you gave, and a lot of the historical issues and things of that. So I think that most people can read this and understand what you're trying to do. And then if my listeners listening in on this conversation, I think it helps inform a lot more of that as well, and some of the heart behind it. So I really appreciate the writing. I appreciate you coming on. Is there anything you want to say as we wrap up?
No, I'll just end with kind of what I'm really excited about the book for. I want, sometimes it takes stepping into another world or another culture to help us see our world better. And so basically I kind of designed the book to help you step into the first century. Be able to look around. I have tons of pictures in it to just give you a sense of what that world looked like and how Christianity emerged in that world. And I hope spending, 200 pages in that world, you'll step away and it'll just feed your imagination for how Christians can be beautiful and different in all the best ways today, in a way that I think we're struggling with right now as American culture.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I think that's a great way to explain the book itself, and I think you accomplished what you wanted to, and it was really a good read, and it reads quick, so people even who aren't like avid readers can read this and get through it pretty quickly. So again, I appreciate you coming on. It was great to meet you. I've read a lot
You
of
as
your
well.
stuff, so it was nice to be able to chat about it. Thanks, Nijay.
Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you for joining the Pistis with Us podcast. To keep the conversation going beyond the camera, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and subscribe to our YouTube page, as well as wherever you listen to your podcasts.